Throughout her life, she viewed the motto engraved on the Supreme Court building as her mission, equal justice for all. Her passions may have been opera or grueling daily workouts, but her deep, abiding commitment was the pursuit of justice for all. Although not a Rotarian, her values resonate with us: integrity, truthfulness, service, and collegiality with those you agree and disagree with. She's a role model to many generations because of her values and how they cross generational and cultural lines. There's a good reason she's known as the notorious RBG. Her work was about using our laws to be fully inclusive of all identities in our country. She expanded the equal protections defined in civil rights law and our Constitution to include not only race, but religious orientation, sex, gender, and other categories. She was brilliant in her legal opinions, creative in her discussions, and persuasive in her arguments. May we dedicate our lives, our actions to her memory. We have challenges before us that demand we use our brilliance, our creativity, our persuasiveness, our integrity, our truthfulness, our collegiality to address these challenges. Let us engage all of us equally, respectfully. We need us. Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. That was beautiful. With that, I would like to turn it over to Troy Szymanski, who is our club secretary and is partner and fund manager of Outpost Fund.
Thank you very much, President Debbie. All right, let's start off by welcoming our guests. We have Chad Kroll, guest of Jim Johnston, Bernice Passett, who is John Klug's wife, Chris Beasley, President Debbie's husband, as well as visiting Rotarian Ann Tull. We also have Linda Clark, Katie Katanak, Bill Bass, Lois Perry, and Nazrin Ansari. Also, thank you to everybody else who is joining us, who I wasn't able to welcome personally. Next up, we have not some birthdays, we have one birthday. So this week we want to wish a happy birthday to Ted Friedman. Send him a card, send him a message. We're glad you're joining us today. As I pull up the announcements, President Debbie, I think it's great that you mentioned the article in the Rotary magazine. My mom, actually, who's a Rotarian in Oklahoma, called me earlier this week, very excited to read about it and noticing our club prominently featured in it. So definitely check it out if you get the chance. All right. Back on schedule this week. Join us this evening at 5:30 for our Rotary virtual happy hour. There will be a link to that in the meeting recap email to follow after this meeting. Our very first hybrid in-person and online meeting is next Thursday, October 1st at the Warwick Hotel. Our speaker is Rotarian Bob Hardaway, professor of law at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law, for our program titled The Electoral College, the U.S. Senate, and the Constitution, the Case for Preserving Federalism. If you'd like to attend in person, reservations are a must. Due to our 42-person limitation and COVID safety measures, we are unable to accommodate walk-ins. The deadline to register is this Monday. No reservations for Zoom attendance are required, however, so log on if you're not able to make it, and we hope to see you in person or online. Family of Rotary. As you were notified, longtime member Phil Pankey passed away last week. The family does not have plans at this time to hold a memorial due to the pandemic, but we will be sure to notify you when we hear more. Past club president Bill Houston's wife, Jane, passed away this morning as well. As you were notified last week, Jane has been suffering from Alzheimer's disease and was recently in the hospital for 5 days and then taken home and under the care of hospice. Former member Dean Louderman also passed away last week. He was a member of Denver Rotary for 38 years before transferring to the Denver Southeast Club. It goes without saying it's been a very tough week for our family of Rotary. Please be sure to reach out to your fellow Rotarians to show support and to keep them in your thoughts and prayers during these extremely challenging times. President Debbie, that's all from me.
Thank you very much, Troy. Please do reach out to our fellow Rotarians if you're able, and that would be well received, I'm sure. All right, with that, the next item on the agenda is actually an announcement from me about Q2, second quarter dues announcement. So as you know, in July, we shared an update about dues and first quarter dues, looking at the budget, making sure we were tending to the care of our Rotarians and to the care of our club, making sure we were fiscally responsible at the same time as being fiscally fair. So with that, we pledged at that time, I pledged at that time to come back on a quarterly basis at a minimum and let you know how things looked from a budgetary standpoint. We have multiple levers that impact our budget. They include our membership, our meals, venues, etc. So with that, looking at Q1 results where we came in favorable to budget by a couple $1,000s, and looking at a projection for Q2, which will be October 1st through December 31st, the board has voted and supports my recommendation to maintain dues for quarter 2 to be at the same levels as quarter 1. That means all membership levels stay the same, budget or dues amounts stay the same. As you know, meetings in the second quarter will be offered as a hybrid on some weeks where we have both Zoom and in-person options. For those in-person attendees, we will ask that the in-person attendees pay $25. That covers our expense at the Warwick. It includes the food, the room, the audio-visual support. So it is exclusively about covering those costs. There's none of that that goes back into our club budget. Well, the board also voted to approve to cover the costs of all members that we will pay for your Rotary International President's Dinner. So in November, I believe it's November 1st, thank you, Harriet. There will be a luncheon and on a Sunday, but it will be at a time that our RI president, who's in Germany, will be able to host a Rotary President's luncheon, brunch. So the cost will be $28. The club will pay for you to attend. We'd like to promote this event and show support for attendance. There are a number of other events coming up that we had in the budget that have been impacted by the pandemic. Those include the stock show, which will not be held in person this year. That also includes a large club conference that will be virtual. So all of those factors and membership factors and meal factors go into this quarter 2 recommendation. So you'll see that that has been approved and you'll see that reflected in your Q2 invoice. With that, I hope if it's eased your pocketbook a little bit, it will also incent you to share good news to support our foundation, and you can share your news that way. And with that, I will turn it over to Harriet.
Thank you, President Debbie. So, time for Good News Red Bucket. Your opportunity to share news, updates, announcements with your fellow Rotarians and our visitors. We ask for a minimum contribution of $20. You'll make the donation using the link I just posted to the chat, and Lauren will include the same link in the after meeting summary email. So if you have news to share, raise your hand literally or through the participants list at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you can raise your hand virtually, and Lauren, Debbie, or I will call on you. When we do, you can then unmute yourself to make your announcement. As a reminder, for the first half of this fiscal year, the proceeds for the Good News Red Bucket go to our club's own Denver Rotary Club Foundation, or DRCF. with all the good works it does throughout the year. The very worthy causes include health clinics in Kenya, Roma education in Bosnia, broadband for education and healthcare throughout Colorado, Denver Kids, high school scholarships, mentorships, and so much more. Remember our President Debbie's theme for this year, the power of one. You make a difference in many different ways. So who has good news to share?
Yeah.
I see Bob Kapelke.
All right.
This is not good news, and as you learned, Jane Houston passed away this morning, and so I'd like to make a contribution to the Red Bucket in memory and in honor of Jane and the entire Houston family. It's just been a long, tough struggle for her.
Thank you, Bob.
Okay.
And anyone else have news or announcements?
We will not have red buckets the next 2 weeks based on our agenda and the time frame. So this is your chance.
I'd like to make a donation and announce my good news, even though I'm not the Rotarian, but an invited guest. So if I'm still able to do that.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Greatly appreciated.
My pleasure. So I'm an Afghan American who reside in Aurora, Colorado. My background is healthcare administration, and recently, coming from a nonprofit organization, International Orphan Care, whose work is in Afghanistan, I've been able to get a group of technical people together to create our first oxygen concentrator for Afghanistan. So the components are in the process of being ordered from and imported from outside to Afghanistan, and hopefully we'll be able to create our very first oxygen concentrator to combat the lack of oxygen in hospitals, medical grade hospitals in Afghanistan. And I have a project for you all to be coming your way soon for funding a 50-bed hospital for a centralized oxygen system. So this is my way of giving back to you all for the wonderful work that you do. So thank you.
Thank you, Nazra.
My pleasure.
I see in the chat too that Mary Penny made a donation in honor of Jane.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Mary. I see Ann.
April as well.
Yeah.
So Young Cho.
And then Ann Toll after that.
Yes. Whoops, I already unmuted.
Okay, Ann. Young, you're up next.
I'd like to donate $50 in their memory of Jane and for Bill. I've known them since college, so we go back most of our lives.
Thank you, Ann. Young Cho, you need to unmute yourself.
Bill Emig and Marjorie Lewis also have their hands up.
I just wanted to join the others who are donating in honor of Jane Houston.
Thank you, Bill.
Marjorie?
Yeah, I have good news. My second book is published. It is entitled Singing Songs in a Strange Land, Anecdotes on Resilience. So I'm really excited about it, and I am unashamedly promoting it. Thank you.
And if you haven't read the first one, I highly encourage it. I got it at a book club. It's really good.
Thank you.
In fact, it's on my nightstand, permanent fixture. Any others?
And I'm not seeing any raised hands in the participant list. So with that, I want to thank everyone for your generous donations. And Debbie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. All right, well, it is my extreme pleasure to introduce Ved Nanda, who's doing our program introduction, to welcome back our very own Christopher Hill. So I'm very excited. Ved is a professor, University of Denver College of Law. He's much more than that, as we all know, but I'd like to turn it over to Ved for our program introduction. Oops, you're muted, Ved. Hold on. Let's see.
President Debbie, thank you very much. What a privilege, what an honor to present to this club our own Ambassador Chris Hill. What a superb career, what wonderful accomplishments. 4 times in 4 countries, some hot spots as an ambassador. He has worked also Department of State. He is the one who represented the US as the chief delegate of the 6-party conference on North Korean peace talks. And I think you have read in the bio, very short, doesn't do justice to all that he has accomplished, but how much he has done. And I think for me personally, it is very special that in one of his incarnations, he was the dean of our Korbel school. And at that time, you probably know, not simply for the university, for its students and faculty, for alumni, but for the entire community. He's the one who made immense contributions by his talks, by meeting with people, and I think we sorely miss him. But at the same time, he at the present time is at Columbia, a named professor, and I hope that in the days to come, where he is destined to be, to play a much bigger role in Washington, and that will happen. I was privileged when he came here because I was on the search committee, and I was thrilled when he came to the University of Denver. And I said, we miss him. To my own fellow Rotarians, please join me in very, very warmly welcoming an ambassador extraordinary. And actually, if I'm got to say, he is one of the very, very best people that we have in our own cadre of ambassadors. So a diplomat that is superb, a good friend that I can be honored to call. I kindly, warmly welcome Chris Hill.
Thank you very much, Ved. It's always a pleasure to be with you, whether in reality or virtually. For those of you who don't know, I came to Korbel, the Korbel School, some 10 years ago. I did it by a search committee that University of Denver had, and Ved was on the search committee. That day, however, when I interviewed for the position from my living room in Baghdad, Ved was unable to actually attend the search committee meeting, so he did it by telephone, and his wife Catherine was in the room. And so I tried to answer as best I could all the questions being posed by the search committee. And then Catherine apparently said to Ved, he's the guy I want. And so Ved voted for me, and I really appreciate Catherine's input on that. I can say Julie and I just loved our time in Denver, really enjoyed the opportunity to build a new building for the Korbel School. They had a sort of 1970s building, and we got a donor to give us funds for a 5-story building with a blue tower thrown in. So if you're ever driving past the University of Denver and you see the Anna and John C. Building, think back to when I talked to John C. about that at the Wash Park Grill. I had invited him to lunch, and he suggested that he could give us $20 million for that building, and I quickly paid for the lunch. So I think it went very well, and I'm very pleased that future generations of students at the Korbel School will have this very nice facility, which came from John and Anna C. So today I've been asked to talk about sort of future foreign policy challenges, of which there are many. Needless to say, the elephant in the room is, who's going to be president after January 21st, or who's going to be president-elect after November 4th. I don't need to tell anyone that this is obviously going to be a very consequential election, and it's going to be an election that I suspect is going to be very close. Julie and I are now in Florida getting ready to go to our next posting, if you will, at Columbia University. But Florida is quite up for grabs right now. Very close polling data. So it's really kind of hard to say who will win on November 3rd. No Republican has won the presidency without winning Florida since Calvin Coolidge. You can look it up. And so obviously this state is very important to the current president, but I must say it's also very understood by the challenger, former Vice President Biden, that he also needs to win Florida. So it's kind of fun to see what's going on here. But I think looking beyond the election, I think it's fair to say our country has a lot of challenges. I don't want to turn this into a political talk, of course, but I will say that in these two candidates, there are two very different views of what our country's role in the world should be, and I think those views will play out very dramatically in the new year, 2021. President Trump has been very active in foreign policy, or at least through his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, in recent weeks, maybe recent months, where he's tried to kind of nail a few accomplishments. This is what presidents do as they get closer to re-election. His accomplishments of late have been that is, they've been accomplishments just in the last few weeks. One of them, of course, is to get some Arab countries to recognize Israel, something these countries haven't done at all. And so instead of just having Jordan and Egypt recognizing or diplomatically recognizing Israel, we now have additional countries, including Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. In addition, of course, the president and his son-in-law and his Secretary of State have been working on some other countries to recognize Israel. Some of it has been a little transactional, if you will. With respect to Sudan, he said, look, you don't have any direct problem with Israel. Why don't you recognize Israel? Sudan said, no, thanks. And then the president's team suggested, well, if you recognize Israel, we'll take you off the list of state sponsors of terrorism. And Sudan has been wanting to get off that list, especially as being on that list means the U.S. will very much limit the scope of any economic assistance or any kind of assistance to that country. So now we have Sudan recognizing Israel. Whether it means something, of course, you'll have to ask the Sudanese, but it does speak to the fact that the president has made very clear that he wants to see more Muslim majority countries or even Arab countries recognizing Israel. And so will that process continue after the election? Not so sure. I think it gets harder and harder, especially when you get to countries like Saudi Arabia and countries that have been much more in the forefront in terms of supporting the Palestinians. Where this leaves the Palestinians right now is very much out in the cold. But as someone who lived in Iraq, I can tell you there's a lot of Arab resentment of the fact that the Palestinians don't know how to say yes to any proposals, and frankly have put themselves in a situation where, to some extent, countries around the world have lost a lot of sympathy for them. I think President Trump feels very strongly that the Palestinians have not done enough to secure their own future. And I think in the coming period, we'll see a president who doesn't change his mind there, but perhaps we'll see a Palestine authority trying to do something more about its future. So in the meantime, we see a kind of rapprochement between Israel and some Arab countries, which I suspect will continue. Again, it's going to be hard to get additional countries to recognize Israel, but I think we've known, or I think the general public has known since the period of the Arab Spring, some 9 years ago, that there are other things going on in the Middle East besides the issue of how countries stand on Israel. And so I don't think we've seen the end of some of those conflicts in the Middle East. And one of them, of course, is the issue of the Shia minority in the Middle East, very much having its problems with the Sunni majority in the Middle East. Now, one of really the only Shia majority country that is actually run by a Shia majority government is Iraq itself. For that reason, Iraq has not managed to be close to the other Sunni Arab countries, and instead actually has kind of reached out and been reached out to by the Iranians. And so many of the Sunni Arab countries regard Iraq as a country that can't be relied on from the perspective of being an Arab country. So it took a long time, for example, for the Gulf Cooperation Council, grouping of Arab countries, to recognize or accept Iraq into their ranks. And I think Iraq kind of found itself to be somewhat of the black sheep of in the Arab world. How that continues is rather hard to say, because Iraq, one of the reasons the rest of the Arab world did not really appreciate Iraq was the fact that it had so many American soldiers in it. There's a perception that Iraq hasn't done as well for its Sunni minority. So Iraq has a lot of work to do in terms of the rest of the Arab world. But meanwhile, it's continued to have this closer relationship with Shia-led Iran. Now, you can say, well, if Iraq, which is some 60% Shia, 20% Kurdish, and 20% Sunni, if Iraq has this Shia majority, why didn't we give some thought to that before we invaded Iraq? Because essentially what's happened is the one country that has gotten closer to Iraq over the past decade is in fact Iran. And I think there's a lot of concern about that, especially in the Trump administration, which sees a future US-Iran relationship very much adversarial. And I think it's fair to say that the Secretary of State has gone beyond the nuclear issue. It's not just a question of whether the Iranians are prepared to live up to past commitments to forswear the development of nuclear weapons. I think it's pretty clear that Secretary Pompeo, and I think it's supported by the president, believe that there ought to be a regime change in Iran. That is, the Ayatollahs ought to step aside, and the much more sort of technocratic, and one could even say more modern sector of Iran in the capital city of Tehran, as opposed to the sort of religious center of Qom, would actually somehow come to the fore, and that Iran would be a much more secular place that could have a better relationship with the West and elsewhere. I think it's going to be very difficult. To be sure, the Iranians have had their share of economic problems, and those economic problems are made worse by the efforts of the Trump administration to make sure that Iran suffers, and Iranian people suffer every day for the sin of having pursued some nuclear programs. But it's not at all clear that there's any kind of coalition of forces that can overthrow the mullahs who are essentially running the country. And I think as this administration pushes harder and harder on Iran, there has been a kind of tendency to use this kind of foreign pressure to say to its people, you may not like us, the mullahs, but you've got to like the US a lot less. And so it has kind of increased tensions. And I think some of these tensions could well in the coming years spill onto some of the into the Shia minority countries in the Arab world. As I mentioned, Iraq is kind of an exception with a Shia majority of some 60%. But if you look at Kuwait, for example, there's a substantial Shia minority of some 40 and possibly more percent of Kuwait. In addition, the Shia minority, is in Saudi Arabia is very much concentrated in the East Province, but that's also where the oil is concentrated in Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudis will be concerned about this Shia minority getting more and more influenced by a very frustrated and more belligerent Iran. In addition, you have Lebanon, and we certainly got a glimpse of that in the last month or so, when they had that terrible explosion in the port in Beirut. At first, our president called it terrorism. Appears not to have been terrorism. It appears to have been a situation where they left a lot of ammonia nitrate fertilizer unsecured, and it eventually blew up. There may be some untoward effort to make that happen, but most people think it was an accident. But it speaks to the fact that I think many Lebanese are very frustrated with their own government. And so a country like Lebanon with a Shia majority may actually be a country that is ripe for some sort of regime change in a violent way. And my own view is violent regime change usually leads to a worse situation. So that's another one we have to watch. And then finally, within the Middle East, we have to look at Syria, which where you have a kind of Shia majority there in the form of the Alawites, and who are the backbone of the Assad government. But we have seen that regime has actually strengthened itself and done so with Iranian help. So some of the sort of combustible material for further crises in the Middle East very much there, because Iran is very active, and I think expected to be so, unless there's some effort by the US to try to work with Iran and try to find what can be done on a way forward. I think if the new president is Joe Biden, a person that I hosted on about 6 occasions when I was in Iraq. It was interesting. The Secretary of State only came once for 2 hours, that is Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden, for whatever reason, came some 6 times. The reason actually was the president. President Obama wanted him to sort of take control of where we were in Iraq and try to make sure they had a better government so that we could get our troops out. So I think under a Biden administration, you would find an effort really to see about the problems of the Middle East, not necessarily related to Israel. Now, Mr. Biden has already complimented, believe it or not, the Trump administration on the progress in getting other countries to recognize Israel. But I think Mr. Biden knows, as I know, that it's a bigger and broader problem than just the issue of diplomatic recognition. So I think we'll see an administration sort of engaged more in the region, engaged very much politically, trying to sort of tamp down Sunni and Shia problems, and probably going back to the agreement with Iran and to see whether there's something with Iran that can be worked out that will somehow stabilize the situation between Sunnis and Shia in the Middle East. You know, the Iranian foreign minister, I think many of you know, is a graduate of the University of Denver. I've met with him several times, and I met with him last year when the UN General Assembly met, and he indicated that they would be prepared to kind of open up the talks again with the Europeans, the U.S., the Russians, and the Chinese to see if there's something we could do to make that agreement or to put that agreement kind of back in force vis-a-vis the U.S. And Zarif indicated that they might be willing to take some of the obligations on their part that were 10-year obligations, 8-year obligations, and make them permanent obligations rather than limited. So I think that would probably be something very interesting for a Biden administration. And I would expect in the coming years to see some improvement in the U.S.-Iran relationship. The question of dealing with Ayatollahs, well, there are two ways to deal with that. One is to try to push them out. And usually when you try to push people out, they hold on with even greater tenacity. The other approach is to try to have a more normal relationship, create some expectations in the society, and see a loosening of the grip that way. And I think we'll see that kind of approach coming from the Biden administration, as opposed to what the Trump administration has done, which is to try to make a kind of vigorous effort to get the regime in Iran to be changed. So Middle East, as always, is going to be very important. In many respects, it's not as important to the U.S. as it used to be. If you look at our production of non-traditional oil through horizontal drilling and fracking, et cetera. And by the way, that I have no doubt will continue. There have been rumors that Biden will try to put a moratorium on fracking. I seriously doubt it, not when a state like Pennsylvania is up for grabs. So, so I think the U.S. will continue to have this production of oil. Probably some countries will start to import from the U.S. And I think we may well see the U.S. not only as a leading producer, but will become a leading exporter if this technology continues to be as promising as it has been, and of course, depending on the price of oil. And the price of oil goes beyond my talk to the Rotary, because if I knew what it would be, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to the Rotary Club. I'd be speculating on oil. So, so the Middle East will be important. It will continue to be important, even though we have our own support, oil supplies. It's very important to the Europeans. And I think you will see a much greater effort, the U.S., to work with the Europeans generally. Now, President Trump took an agreement that was reached in 2014 at the summit in Wales. And one of the things the member states agreed on is that the member states need to have more robust militaries. The U.S. military is kind of too much, is sort of too great a percentage of capabilities within the NATO alliance. So in 2014, it was agreed that all countries needed to boost their expenditures as a percentage of gross domestic product to some 2%. Well, very few countries have been able to do that, and I believe, I could be wrong, there are fewer than 10 countries that have succeeded. And I think the Trump administration has made this the real litmus test of whether a country is a good ally or not, and that is whether that country has reached 2%. I would argue there are a whole host of other things that we want to see more from our NATO allies. We want to see a commitment to overseas deployments, as they have done in Iraq, and then later Afghanistan. We want to see that kind of preparedness to deal with some of these hotspots where some kind of peacekeeping force is required. I think there's also an understanding in Europe that 2% for Slovenia, or 2% for a smaller economy like Poland, which has achieved the 2%, is not the same as Germany achieving the 2%. And frankly, Germany does a lot of other things in Europe. And moreover, Germany has had a very high growth rate. And I think there's even some countries in Europe who might be a little ambivalent about having this already enormous country contributing an even greater percentage of the military capability. So I think you have to look at this with a little more nuance than just saying if you're at 2% or above, you're a good guy, and if you're below 2%, you're not a good guy. And I think the Biden administration would certainly insist and work hard on the issue of getting more NATO capabilities and not having the U.S. have to babysit every meeting. But at the same time, I think the Biden administration understands that it's kind of a two-edged sword asking other countries to spend more when in fact we may want them to do other things. For example, the whole Southern European financial catastrophe that looked quite desperate some 8 years ago was essentially alleviated by the Germans. And so we have to be respectful that Germany does a lot of very important and positive things. And even if their 2% military expenditure is not quite there. So I think we'll see a much more collegial approach to dealing with the Europeans. The effort to shift forces eastward, for example, the Trump administration took some decisions which I personally like a lot, which is putting more troops in places like Poland, where you are essentially looking at the kind of eastern edge of NATO and trying to forward deploy some of those forces. I think it's been important. I think it's kind of helped calm things down in Poland as they worried about this kind of newly belligerent Russia. And I think Poles have been very happy to be in NATO, but they wanted to see some signs that NATO's in them. And I think the Trump administration has done well to do that. I'm sorry it comes only recently in the last couple of months during this in this election year. I think things that are not done during election years have the capacity to have a longer shelf life. But whatever the motivation of the administration, I think it's been good to station more troops and rotate more American troops through Poland. So I think some of that, some of those redeployments would continue even if it's a Biden administration. But I think there will be a real change in tone with the Europeans if there's a Biden administration, and I think that tone is very important because tone in an alliance, how you treat the alliance members, whether you try to work out difficult problems in private rather than through press conferences, I think is really speaks to the quality of the relationship. So I think there could be a real improvement in how we work with the Europeans. This is important for a lot of reasons, and one of the reasons it's important is how we deal with China. We would, I think, be much more effective in dealing with China if, in approaching the Chinese, whether it's on intellectual property rights, whether it's on these out-of-control trade surpluses the Chinese have been running against us, I think it would be much more effective if we could do it together with Europeans and together with other countries that have some of the similar concerns that we do about dealing with the Chinese economy. I think the European countries would like to work with us, and I think it would be important to try to get a relationship with those countries such that we can deploy that very robust relationship in some of our problems elsewhere. China is not going anywhere. China has some 1.4 billion people. It's a very complex place, so you should always be careful when people say the Chinese think this or the Chinese think that. There are a lot of different opinions there. It's a country that's had probably the longest, one of the longest histories in the world. And it's a country that I think has done some remarkable things in recent years. No question, however, the current version of China is a China that is much more kind of hardline and much more insistent on its views. And I think understandably, it's not just President Trump, it's many others, including the Democrats as well, who are concerned about China's behavior. Their handling of their neighbors in Southeast Asia through this issue called the South China Sea, where China has essentially tried to lay claim to the South China Sea as being territorial waters and trying to turn it into a southern Chinese lake. This has been a major concern for China's neighbors, and I think China has been slow to recognize that and instead been very harsh with them. The Chinese have kind of amped up their kind of approach to other countries, not just to us, but to the Europeans and of course their own neighbors. And so you've heard the term wolf diplomacy coming out of China. Well, this is the view that the Chinese foreign ministry was too weak in defending China's interests, sort of the way some people in the United States have felt about the State Department over the years, that somehow the State Department was too weak in kind of pursuing our objectives. Well, that's certainly a criticism going on in China. So if you find yourself in front of a Chinese diplomat and are a little surprised by how he's blasting US policy, understand that he's kind of following this new idea of being a wolf diplomat, that is being very aggressive with anyone who criticizes China. Needless to say, this is not a welcome development, and I don't think it's a way to kind of get back on the same page in dealing with China. But I think we need to understand that it is a more belligerent place than it was in the past. My own view is that we will see a president who, if he wins the election, will give a lot of credit to his tough on China stance. And I think the consequence of that will be that we're not going to see a lot of improvements in China in the bilateral relationship. And the Chinese, frankly, have been rather slow to implement some of these economic agreements because they're concerned that these will be perceived as concessions. And whenever you make a concession, you worry that the other guy's going to ask for more concessions. And this is certainly how President Trump has pursued this. I suspect that if there's a President Biden, there'll be some effort to sit down with the Chinese to kind of map out where we can go on things together, find some patterns of cooperation, do some things together, and have some agreement on rules of the road. That is, blasting each other in press conferences has not proved very helpful to overcoming the problems in the relationship. But I hasten to add that if the Chinese don't make some changes in how they approach the world, and if they continue this kind of belligerence, and if they treat neighbors the way they've treated them in history as tributary states as opposed to sovereign neighbors, I think China will continue to be a handful. And I think whatever administration emerges after our election, they'll have to deal with China accordingly. The U.S. has a lot of allies in the world, allies who feel the same way of some of the Chinese behavior, and I think we can leverage that relationship, but not if we're blasting allies over issues of whether they're paying 1.8% of GDP for their military or 2.0%. So again, I think like in most aspects of life, foreign policy is really about making choices and setting priorities. And I think if we're looking at a more belligerent China in the future, we're going to have to kind of understand this is a major league issue and try to work with partners and allies. In terms of finding an area for the US and China to work on, I would humbly suggest North Korea. Now, there are those who say, oh, China enjoys the situation in North Korea. They like the idea that the North Koreans are developing nuclear weapons and otherwise causing a lot of concerns for the US. I don't think that's really true. I think the Chinese don't want to see the demise of North Korea. They don't want to see the victory of a US-supported South Korea as being the successor state on the Korean Peninsula. They don't want a situation where their model, the Chinese model, communist model, if you will, is deemed a failure while the US model is a victory. So they do have a lot of concerns about wither the Korean Peninsula. But China is one of the few countries which is allowed to, or according to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, allowed to be a nuclear weapons state. And I don't think China has any interest at all in North Korea getting that status. I think the president has taken a whack at this issue in Singapore and Hanoi, even on the demilitarized zone. I would humbly judge his efforts as not having succeeded. And if the president is serious about dealing with North Korea's nuclear approach, he's going to have to change his own and try to marshal some other countries, leverage some other countries. And I think that involves seeing whether we can find some areas to work with the Chinese. So there's going to be no shortage of issues going forward. There's the hardy perennial of the Middle East and the hardy perennial of North Korea. There's going to be a need to try to work together with the Europeans better than we have and try to reach out to allies. I haven't mentioned some of the problems we've had with Japan and Korea, who, when they're not at each other's throats, are very concerned about how the U.S. is treating them. And the president has indicated that all things being equal, he would like to bring troops home. In fact, I asked John Bolton that question a couple of months ago at the Aspen Institute, whether he thought the president, if reelected, would bring troops home. And John Bolton said, yes, he would. And he would try to bring them home from Europe and bring them home from Asia. I think that would be a very different position for the U.S. to be in, a big difference in the post World War II period. And so that would be a real change. And Biden, Vice President Biden, is not of that kind of view. So I think this is a very consequential election in foreign policy, a very consequential election in terms of how the U.S. is regarded in the world, whether we're a country people can work with or whether we're a country that sees ourselves as kind of too good for the world and pulling our interests back from the world. So with those comments, I think I've kind of hit 5 minutes of three, or 5 minutes of one, so I think we can go to questions.
And we do, this is Debbie. Thank you so much. That was enjoyable and informational. I've got a number of questions queued up and I'm going to go through them in the order I got them, and we'll try and get through all of them if possible. What do you think of Bloomberg's initiative of paying off felons' debts to their victims so they can vote in Florida's voting?
You know, I spent a whole career in the Foreign Service not interfering in countries' internal affairs, so I guess I should start by not interfering in my own country's internal affairs. I have a lot of views on it, but I don't think it's really for me to share with the Rotary Club. I'd rather talk about foreign policy issues.
All right, our next question. As an Afghan American who grew up here, what is your opinion about the peace treaty of our president with the Taliban? Knowing their anti-women sentiments, not allowing them to leave the house without a male, the right to education, their lack of formal education aside from the madrasas. This question comes from U.S. pulling forces from the country. Do you think we are setting ourselves to another Charlie Wilson war movie perspective there if we pull out completely?
Okay, I think anyone looking at the situation in Afghanistan, the fact that we have not succeeded in getting the Afghans to have sort of civil government. There are enormous problems in Afghanistan. I think it's understandable why many Americans have kind of thrown up their hands about it and said we need to get out. However, I have great concern with the idea that you can have some kind of deal with an organization like the Taliban, where I don't think there has been a real commitment on the part of the Taliban to work with others. And I think there is very much of a totalitarian approach. So I would pronounce myself very concerned about this arrangement. At the same time, I think the Afghan people need to understand that the U.S. has really tried for, we're now going on a couple of decades here. And I think it's hard for any president to justify to the American people continued efforts. There is no question this could become a far worse humanitarian and human rights catastrophe than it already is. And I'm very concerned about it. But I would also be concerned about the ability of any U.S. leadership U.S. presidential leadership to explain to the American people why after 20 years we should continue there. So that is the problem, and I hope we can get some help in this problem by having an Afghan government do all it can to make the American people see that this has actually been a good investment for us, and one we should continue for some time.
All right, the next question. What are the broad implications of the current America First practices? What about the trade wars with China and Europe?
Yeah, well, I don't think, I'll be very frank with you, I don't think if you have a policy called American First, you're not impressing people with that. And I think our future is embedded in a better future for the world, and not a future in which we regard everyone out there as an adversary, whether an ally or a partner or whoever. And so I think America First kind of assumes this sort of belligerence coming from the rest of the world, and therefore we need to be belligerent toward them. And I'm not sure it really works. I would like to see an America that strengthens international organizations, understands that many of these international organizations, rather than being conspiracies that have denied America its freedom of movement, many of these international organizations have in fact been institutions that have extended U.S. reach. I think we've been very well served by many of these. And so I don't like to hear any American administration talk about the United Nations or the World Trade Organization in terms that would suggest that these organizations are opposed to our interests. These organizations extend our interests. And our concern is that at times countries have not been fair with us, but I think the best way to get them to be fair with us is through these international organizations. Bilateral approaches can be very fraught, very emotional, and ultimately unsuccessful. So I do worry that this concept of America First is to make America alone, and when you're alone, you become afraid, and when you're afraid, you sometimes don't make the right call on things. So I do worry about what this means to our country looking down the road.
And are you able to stay a few extra minutes? We do have a few more questions, and I would like to get through them if people can hang on, and if you can't, that's great.
Sure.
All right, the next question. What is your opinion of the merits, if any, of the Iran nuclear agreement and the Trump administration's abrogation of it? What do you see as the most effective U.S. policy in dealing with Iran's growing nuclear capability?
Yeah, whenever you're out negotiating, I mean, when I got the North Koreans to shut down their reactor and we gave them some heavy fuel oil and stuff like that, you get people back in Washington, why did you give them the fuel oil? And you say, well, I would have liked to shame them into it. I would have liked to have them do something because they thought that what I suggested to them was the right thing, and that my persuasive powers were so overwhelming, they just did the right thing and demanded nothing in return. Unfortunately, that's not the way the world works. Frankly, you never see it in your personal lives, let alone in the relationship between states. So they reach a deal with the Iranians that essentially involved some give and take, especially in terms of the give side. We allowed Iran to have access to these frozen bank accounts that have been frozen for many years. Obviously, there were concerns there that the Iranians could use this money that they have regained access to use in terrorism against other countries. No doubt, there's a risk of that. So we made a tough call to do this. I would have liked to see a negotiation that involved getting to sit down with the Iranians and talk about their behavior in Iraq, their behavior in Lebanon. I would have liked to open the aperture. We did a little of that, but not very much of it. And one of the reasons why was Saudi Arabia and many other Sunni Arab states said, if you're going to talk to the Iranians about Lebanon or Syria, we have to be at the table too. And I think a number of our negotiating partners said, wait a minute, we're trying to get something done on Iran's nuclear appetite. And if we go this route, we're going to turn into this protracted regional effort that may take years to deal with. In the meantime, Iran may have made real progress on their nuclear side. So the idea was to kind of keep it simple and just go after the nuclear issue. You do your best. We have negotiators who do their best, and then someone back home says, I could have done a better job. Well, fine. Go out and try to do it. It's not easy work. In the future, I think it's pretty clear that we do need to broaden the aperture. We do need to get more countries involved and try to calm down some of these Shia-Sunni issues. As I suggested earlier, I don't think you can just take the nuclear issue in isolation. But that said, this notion of this invective toward the people out there trying to do these negotiations. I mean, I got this kind of stuff when I was dealing with the North Koreans. At one point I had, frankly, it was John Bolton and others saying, and our negotiators should not shake their hand. Well, I'm sorry, shaking people's hands is what you do in these things. And I was very amused to see John Bolton himself shaking Kim Jong-un's hand. So it's tough to, take this kind of management from people who have no idea what the difficulties are when you're dealing with these problems.
All right, last question. Will the Kurds ever trust the U.S. again if Biden is elected? And how will this impact overall Middle East relations with our allies? How would we go about gaining the Kurds' trust again, once again, as their crucial partner in the battles against ISIS?
I'm sorry, so the first part was, will the Kurds ever trust us again if Biden is elected?
Correct.
Yes, I sat with Biden many times in his discussions with the Kurds. He had very good relations with the Kurds. I think the Kurds understand, and certainly President Trump hasn't changed this at all, that the U.S. position is that the Kurds of Iraq should be part of Iraq, albeit in an autonomous situation. The Kurds in Syria, just a couple of years ago, had reason to be very concerned about President Trump's decision to pull U.S. forces away from them and leave them kind of at the mercies of the Turks and to some extent the Syrians. So it was mainly an issue of a very capable Turkish army having their way with the Kurds if there were not going to be U.S. troops there. But that's something that happened during President Trump's time. The Kurds have had a pretty tough history through the years, and I think overall, when they survey, who cares about them in the world, I think they feel that the U.S. has given it a good shot, and I think the Kurds want to work with us, whoever the U.S. president is.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. And as you know, one of the Rotary goals is ending polio in the world. And on your behalf, we have donated for 33 children to be inoculated against polio. And with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that will be matched so that 100 children across the world will be inoculated against polio.
Well, thank you very much. That is a great honor. I'm old enough to remember just before that vaccination came along in the late 1950s and how everyone was frightened about polio. And then finally, this almost miraculous vaccination came to happen. And so without calling the situations totally analogous, we do have a pandemic now, and we are all waiting and praying really that we have a vaccination that ultimately is something that I could see someday in the future having Rotary and others deal with, especially in some last remaining countries that haven't succeeded in getting it to their whole population. So thank you very much. I'm very honored by that.
Thank you. And a reminder about next week's hybrid program. It will be a combination of in-person and Zoom. If you are going to be there in person, your reservation is absolutely required by Monday at 1 o'clock. Our speaker will be our very own Bob Hardaway, professor of law, DU Sturm College of Law, and Club 31 Rotarian on the Electoral College, the US Senate, and the Constitution, the case for preserving federalism. So with that, we'll do the Rotary four-way test. So join along. Of the things we think, say, or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Chris. So great to see you. Great to have you with us today.
Great to see you again.